Hi guys, Editing Umnia here. Just wanted to let you know, I am reading off of a script in this video. It's quite obvious because my eyeline keeps shifting. If it's distracting, please do just listen to this like a podcast. Otherwise, thank you for your patience as I learn how to do these.
Hi guys, Umnia here. I speak to you today from a place of complete and total ignorance. I know nothing of sex, the erotic, or partnership. I am a chaste and lonely woman who enjoys pleasure in the form of iced coffee and Daft Punk records. This is the truth. I know nothing of sex. Who, me, in this world of easily accessible erotica? No, I know nothing of sex. And yet, I shall talk with authority on the subject. Funny how that works. My generation, Gen Z, is not sex repulsed. Fake news. We live in an era of erotic novels flying off the shelves, kink in the mainstream, ethical pornography, OnlyFans, and then OnlyFans models sharing their political views and life experiences on TikTok. Tumblr, I believe, is actually still alive. Never in history has there been a hornier place for Gen Z than Tumblr. The thing with this discussion is the thing with all discussions. The sex-repulsed members of our generation are loud. Most of the rest of us are horny in a much quieter fashion. This is in some ways because sexuality, eroticism, and pleasure have been feminized. To spend time on sex or to string it out and build erotic tension has been relegated to women, whereas the most acceptable form of discussion on the subject in public has been masculinized and held up in high esteem. Sex is a robotic means to an end. See Andrew Tate saying that a man having sex with a woman for over 5 minutes is gay. So the question here is not about whether Gen Z likes sex. The question is what sex and why? Because the answer is almost always sex that isn't being prescribed to them by an old man. And that goes for all genders. I believe the root of this sex repulsion reputation is actually the root of the generational divide. Gen Z are markedly more progressive than the people now tasked with making horny media for them. Success is often lying in creatives who are unabashedly experimental with the ways they portray intimacy on screen. Often women and queer people. What tends to turn off our generation is the girl on her knees, missionary position, skinny bodies and spaces approach of yesteryear that is much better improved by a chubby reader fan fiction published to AO3 on any good Thursday. The hottest sex scenes I've seen in releases from the past 12 months and upcoming releases have all played with the concept of danger, tension, repression, fear, excitement, and fulfillment, and in doing so created deeply romantic and thrilling erotic landscapes that no one can refute or refuse. So am I saying sex scenes aren't woke enough? No. In some cases, yes, but generally no. What I'm saying is that old men on average have no sexual imagination. They didn't need to progress past the prescribed sexuality in general because that sexuality was never kept from them. Its easy access, its permissibility, actually stifles their imaginations, as they could quite easily be satisfied with the bare minimum. In conversations like these, I often think about Euphoria, not to bring him up. Specifically a scene in season 2 which I believe the creator, believed he'd really push the boundaries on. The same thing happened in The Brutalist, actually. This magic, radical thing of a man going down on a woman. Really shaking the table there, boys. But in some senses they are. That is radical if you come from a linear patriarchal tradition of sexuality. You think you're thinking really far and wide with that one. Something else people mistake for this is the idea that porn rots men's brains and sends them down a spiral of more and more depraved content until they've gotten into some horrific kinks. I have yet to see evidence of this. The kinkiest people I've met are often queer, where, unable to properly express their desires at a developmentally correct age, they develop elaborate ways of being able to access their sexuality in consensual spaces, the likes of which would scare any given Pornhub dude bro into a coma. No, porn isn't making men more kinky than they were before, maybe more openly kinky, but it is making them more violent, maybe. The jury is out on which one of those is the chicken and which one is the egg, in my opinion. Men? Violent? Groundbreaking. If you've ever frequented those sites, which I certainly never have, you will anecdotally know that there really is to this day a very steady pattern, rhythm, and 3 to 4 act structure to porn that hasn't really changed since the 70s. I've heard from people. No. Pornhub is not where the innovation lies. So when porn-informed men write erotic work, whether on screen or in other mediums, they tend to end up breasting boobily into caricature, and often end up somewhere very unwatchable or unreadable. They're attempting to stretch an imaginative muscle they've never had to use. Erotic imagination, I'm starting to think, is actually exercised through yearning and repression. It is through the not having of a thing, the restriction of access, the filling of the proverbial hole of lack, that provides founts of inspiration, innovation, imagination, and yes, freaky interpretation. Almost all the good erotic writers I know are writing to fulfill some untapped potential in a show, in a missed connection, in a fantasy partner, in a future they can look forward to. This doesn't mean the best erotic work comes from virgins and celibates, no. Sometimes, no. Rather, that you only need to map the sense memory of something in concrete terms if it's not being fulfilled elsewhere. Maybe you're sleeping with people a lot, but you're not sleeping with that person. Maybe you're married, but your partner isn't a knight, or a mage, or dominant, or the character in your favourite TV show. There are endless ways someone writes from the not having, and in the writing, attempts to understand themselves and their desires better. One of the standout examples of this in the last year, bite me, was Baby Girl. The film served as a treatise by the writer-director Helena Rayan on her own sexuality, God I hope I pronounced her name correctly, and the conflicting feelings she had about it, while also exploring the generational divide. In doing so, using extreme circumstances to highlight the nuances of the core issue. She also created a visual language rich with context and unspoken understandings. This was what enticed people, and made the entire film watchable even in the most awkward of moments. Many people have had a lot to say about Baby Girl, often because they went in thinking they were getting one thing and got another, but on its own merits, it's a fantastic piece of work, where exploration of sexuality is the end goal of the piece. I believe it was Catherine Vela-Bogan that posed, and I'm paraphrasing, that queer people tend to have a sympathetic relationship to intimacy, a sense of what the other desires, as an extension of the longing and yearning that often creates distance between two potential intimate partners, especially when that longing is repressed by a homophobic culture. That anticipation of needs also lends itself to fantastic erotic imagination, and it's with this knowledge that I now want to talk about challenges. No one had any widespread genuine issues with the sex scenes and sexy scenes in Challenges as a whole. I have many issues with the discourse around Challenges, but the horniness displayed by both the characters and the audience members weren't an issue at all. I believe this is because Luca maintained a clarity of focus as to what story he was telling, alongside of course Justin Kuritzky's amazing script, and the tension between the three characters never wavered in that pursuit. Because each scene moved the plot forward, intimacy was another means for them to compete against one another. And isn't that the bottom line? If sex scenes are the means to an end, by all means make some ethical porn if you'd like. Lord knows people will love it. But when you're trying to tell an engaging story, intimacy cannot halt that story, much like some random side character with very little atmospheric purpose. Intimacy can serve as so many different functions in a story, so when it's purposeless, it's hard to miss. Basically, don't just stand there. Do something! Sex for sex's sake, one might believe, is a cinematic tradition, but often the intimacy between characters opens up a very specific new dynamic of closeness, separateness, anger, trust, or all of the above, providing context to the following scenes and building on the previous. Often, the sex wasn't just put there, but in that way, any sex scene can be interpreted in a myriad of ways. So it shouldn't really matter if you throw one in there, it will have some kind of meaning, much like a Rorschach. People will see the meaning there even if you didn't give it any. However, I believe at the end of the day the quality of a sex scene belies the quality of the storytelling. There is no example I can think of where the sex scene was the deal breaker for me. If it had been cut, I still wouldn't have enjoyed the film. I want to rebut the argument made in Revolutionary Desires by Juan Lim Tam, which is a brilliant start for this conversation and helped me structure my argument in this piece. Tam posits that the need for a sex scene to have a purpose is internalized capitalism par excellence. This on its own is a brilliant observation. But any story, therefore, that seeks to have a purpose, focus, and drive a plot forward is intending to be productive in its pursuit, and therefore could be called internally capitalist. Any piece of work that perhaps doesn't take the Lynchian approach could be seen this way, and even then, a lot of Lynch's work had a very specific purpose. Further, nothing truly random ever happens in a David Lynch film. So you see, sex for sex's sake in the real world makes all the sense. In the context of discarding the drive to productivity, it is revolutionary to have sex often, and without a set endpoint or goal. Massive shout out to the lesbians at the vanguard of that revolution. But stories are, by definition of their structure, and in every breaking of their structure, an exercise in productivity by way of being an exercise in communication. Piece of art, you must first be hit with the muse, and the muse is trying to communicate something through the artist and the medium. Communication can only be completed if you make a purposeful effort to do so. Otherwise, one would ramble and lose the attention of the receiver quite easily, as I'm sure I've lost a bunch of people by now on this video. So you see, stories have to be productive in order to communicate. As I said before, any sex scene thrown anywhere without meaning would inevitably generate its own meaning, but that doesn't immediately generate its context. In fact, without purpose, a sex scene feels out of place, not as some disruption to order or some tangent to a conversation, but a muddling of the communication altogether. I can think of many examples where an intimate scene badly placed in a work has completely ruined the entire message of the film. Far from muddying the waters or showing human messiness, it instead completely threw the entire film into question. Instead of the film wrestling with this, it returned to its train tracks and continued as if nothing had happened. I'm looking at you, Blade Runner. And now the elephant in the room. Everyone is beautiful, and no one is horny. When you sterilize the mainstream portrayals of love and relationships, you sterilize the intimacy. The sexual charge, the animal reference is lost when the entire aesthetic of the romance is airbrushed of any character. No one can believe the intimacy in the context of a story if everyone looks a little too pretty and the sex is going off without a hitch. Because that's not authentic. Gen Z are the authenticity generation. They simply don't believe you when you put pretty people next to each other and make them have pretty sex. Yes, that includes them falling off the bed and giggling and making little quips. At the end of the day, the sex was immaculate. It happened without discussion before, there was no real discussion during, and there's unlikely to be a talk after. Everyone looks picture perfect, everyone's pleasure looks the way it's supposed to, and everyone's young and slim and hot and usually white. There's no shock jockeying when that's your baseline. The Augusses of the world don't delight me. The nooks and crannies they find are often just incest and violence. These aren't the imperfections of the erotic imagination, the tension and release. This is spaghetti thrown at a wall. When Gen Z talk about unnecessary sex scenes, I believe they're saying, I can watch this for free on Pornhub. It has no more substance than the robotic stuff I can find for free on Pornhub. Why should I care about this? Why have I paid to watch this? When Gen Z walk out of the theatre with their knees shaking, making jokes about soaking the seat or writing copious fan fiction about a piece of work, it's because some deeper note was struck, the likes of which quick, instant gratification on the hub sites cannot give them. A long-form story that taps into their biggest hopes and their deepest fears, and by doing so, eroticizing them, and by doing that, entertaining them. I want to take a quick tangent before we finish, but you'll realize soon it's not really a tangent, it is kind of the point. A word on intimacy coordinators. I can always tell when someone hasn't used one because the sex scenes are shit. This was a word on intimacy coordinators. That isn't actually all I have to say. I think it's easy to forget viscerally, even when everyone remembers logically, that the concept of an intimacy coordinator was born out of the abuse of the sex scene in the workplace of a set. I'm still hearing stories, to this day, of my peers, young actors with no choice in the matter, clearly being used as sexual puppets on camera for the gratification of their directors and DOP, with no regard for their boundaries and with no intimacy coordination in sight. In 2025. There is absolutely zero on-set protections against this. Even though the industry claims it cares, it is often up to the director whether an intimacy coordinator is brought in, and the disdain for them by, you guessed it, older male creatives is palpable in the culture. I believe this needs to be paid attention to. An intimacy coordinator is not shy or squeamish about sex. They are the stunt coordinators of the form, as Rayan quite rightly said in an interview for Baby Girl. They are both there to negotiate boundaries for the actors and serve the director's vision. And yet all the men that hate their function in the industry immediately go to the "it's unsexy, it gets between me and my actor's" defense. Does a stunt coordinator get between you and your actors? No? Because you don't want to actually beat up your actors. Okay, so what's the issue? I believe the issue is directors have gotten way too comfortable crossing the boundaries of actors in pursuit of their vision. A lot of directors and a lot of production crew conceive of actors, especially actresses, as emotive set pieces. There for them to get into position to execute their script. Their scripts often are their own indulgence, and the actors are there to play their role. If they're not willing to play that role, they can be replaced. Now let's pause here. Most of what I just said is accepted as baseline, and I don't have an issue with it in principle. A director makes a script based on their tastes, their indulgences. Check, of course. That's creativity. The director then hires an actor willing to do the things put forth in the script. Brilliant! Synergy. These are not things I have an issue with. What I'm referring to is the systematic crossing of boundaries. Often, an actor is willing to do some things and not others. A director, desperate to get that actor specifically to play the role, agrees to the terms. Then, in the heat of production, those boundaries are crossed. often at the moment when the actor has already invested time and effort, where they have the least leverage, and if they break their contract then, wouldn't get paid. That's sinister. When somebody gives you their boundaries and then you coerce them into crossing them, you fundamentally disrespect them. What has this got to do with Gen Z? After the advent of Me Too, many young people realized that the films they'd been consuming were made under duress by the performers they supported. Some films we know the titles of. Others we often guess must have been abusive. Others still we simply don't know. The entire suspension of disbelief for generations of films was disrupted. There is no small part of the sex repulsion or reticence that is tied to this. When we watch a film that includes intimate scenes, we don't know if in 5 years there will be an expose of the whole thing, especially if the scene deviated from the norm, depicted abuse, or was depicting a grey area. This matters, not because we vote with our feet, not because we feel this is the only political action we can take, but because we feel it makes us complicit. If we enjoy a story where the workers were coerced and we contribute to its success, spiritually or financially, that's incongruous with our value system. When reading Revolutionary Desires, Tom mentions Penn Badgley's comment about feeling as if he was cheating on his wife when doing sex scenes, and in a vacuum that seems like a very silly way for him to approach it. We've been told that actors treat sex scenes like work and that any intimation that they are at all intimate is an illusion. But step back for a second. We only started really building the language of intimacy coordination and the advocacy of actors' boundaries in this realm very recently. As unsexy as the industry has made these scenes sound, it is hard to divorce any performance from a truthful one. What makes sex scenes different? Recently, intimacy coordination has been the barrier. The let's talk about it, bring it into the room, and treat it with a professional lucidity. But the tradition of the sex scene has been one without any guardrails, often ripe for abuse, performed in front of crew members, some of which have less than pure intentions or thoughts or comments. I'm not pulling this out of my ass. This is the lived experience of actors until the present day. Nothing has been enshrined in labor law on the subject. Nothing is really ever required. Productions can wave away protections as ruining the process, and actors often glorify the idea of going through these traumas, as actors of previous generations had to, as a way of getting closer to the collective trauma of the craft. This cannot be removed from the discussion. To have good sex on screen, sex that audiences can enjoy, huge sections of audiences are going to need the assurance that the performers were protected during filming. Again, I'm not pulling this out of my ass. This is often the thing everyone mentions when they feel uncomfortable about the intimacy on film. Did they have an intimacy coordinator? He said they didn't use an intimacy coordinator. I'm not sure how I feel about the fact that they didn't have an intimacy coordinator. The unnecessary sex scene defense in general conversation, offline, is often used as a proxy for, did they really have to put the actors through that? All of this ties back to, basically, heterosexist patriarchy. Men are more likely to be directors. Men are more likely to be able to speak up if they're uncomfortable. Men are more likely to cross people's boundaries. Women are more likely to be put in sex scenes. Women's boundaries are more likely to be pushed. Women's sexuality is more likely to be exploited on film. And queer people aren't exempt. They are often put in the same or even worse positions. We are the first generation that knows this much, which means we're the first generation trying to marry the chaotic and wide-ranging history of abuse in the human condition that we have been educated on with the animal imperative to be intimate with one another. This makes us more cautious as a whole. We're the first generation born after AIDS, and what that virus gave the world was an avalanche of sex-negative sentiment and media in a concentrated time period. We are not at all removed from our sexualities. Erotica, porn, smut is at an all-time high of consumption. As a generation, though, we tire of the apps and we don't want any nasty surprises at the bar. It's a math thing. Navigating the world when the entire World Wide Web is at your disposal means you don't get the benefit of naivety. Any risk you take knowingly. And if media has taught us anything, if you take a risk knowingly, you will pay the price. Despite this, Gen Z remain horny. They persist, and I commend my fellow generation members for fighting their good fight. Steamy sex scenes in pursuit of a well-told story can never be wrong, and we vote with our wallet in a lot of cases. A final word. Women and queer people aren't perfect. Some of the perpetrators of abuse on the front I'm describing, and the things I have heard, have been women and queer people doing this to young actors. But I want to see what happens, genuinely, when more queer and female directors take on the sex scene in the 21st century. It seems the best examples of the last year have been exclusively coming from this group of creatives, and if they were given the funding that will inevitably come from the horny renaissance they have started, I wonder what actual creative boundaries could be pushed. I pray without crossing the boundaries of the actual actors. I got through all of that and didn't say male gaze once. Hey, male gaze. Hi, male gaze. How you doing, male gaze? How you doing? I know some of you must be watching male gaze. I love to see the male gaze. Shout out to the male gaze. Any male gaze in the comments section? Let's go male gaze. I want to give one more shout out to Juan Lim Tam. Revolutionary Desires is a fantastic and highly addictive text and a very readable length, and makes amazing points on this entire argument. Their chapter on queering sex was particularly amazing and culminated in an analysis of one of my favorite sex scenes committed to camera, season 1 of Sensei. If you know, you know. Much like Tam, I want to mention that it may be odd to talk about sex at a time like this, but I shall quote another revolutionary queer artist when I remind you that everything is sex, except sex, which is power. You know power. It's just sex. Now ask yourself, who's screwing you? Good night. This video was brought to you by our membership on OBSCURAE.
Oh, hi there, sweetheart. This is Omnia, here to give you the scoop on the relaunch of your favorite publication, OBSCURAE. OBSCURAE, honey, is about bringing you the lowdown nitty-gritty on film, TV, books, music, and all over pop culture, with a style and sophistication that's simply marvelous, if I do say so myself. We go deep on the biggest film festivals in the world and the most exciting new releases, because here at OBSCURAE, the curtains aren't just blue. We're talking film reviews from Challengers to Wicked to Nika to From Ground Zero. We're talking the Sophisticulture podcast with interviews from artists from Oscar-nominated projects. We're talking video essays, honey. Oh yes, video essays. We go deep for the love of art, because we've been reading between the lines since forever, sweetheart. All of this comes wrapped up in a bow of style and sophistication, the likes of which haven't been seen since the 90s when Halle Berry won that Oscar. And much like the 90s when Halle Berry won that Oscar, OBSCURAE is where style meets substance and media literacy meets you. Did somebody say tea? Here at OBSCURAE, we believe that pop culture is art, and art house is for the people. Can I try that again? I've had an idea. Here at OBSCURAE, we believe that pop culture is art, and art house is for the people. So don't be a square Fred instead. Head on over to obscurae.com if you can and see what all the fuss is about. And remember, stay curious, stay critical, and stay fabulous, sweetheart.